Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It is a company with a growing presence around the world, but is Uber cornering so many markets by cutting corners with its drivers? We've been speaking to drivers who work with the company and hearing stories of price cuts and increased commissions to Uber, which drivers say have pushed them below the minimum wage. They say they have little job protection and little support from the firm when they face racial abuse and even violence from customers. Kieran Jenkins has this exclusive report.
In more and more places where you are, they are there too. In Nottingham, in Glasgow, in Stoke-on-Trent, buzzing around, waiting for your fare. These are the drivers of Uber.
I don't see my kids, I don't see my wife, you know.
No holidays, no security. It's a pretty grim existence.
If I've got power, to be honest with you, I'm going to close down Uber in this country.
Well, this is how more and more of us travel now. You simply open the app, it works out where you are, there'll be a car here within a few minutes. Hello, you must be my Uber. Thank you. Now, it is super convenient, but the real draw might just be the price. Uber is often way cheaper than its rivals. Here's the question though, are we just getting a good deal because the people driving us are getting such a bad deal? First stop, the car park of a cafe near Heathrow. Ubers everywhere. There are now 30,000 Uber drivers in London alone. They wait and they wait for a single fare. How many jobs have you had in the last hour or so?
In the last hour, I haven't got no job because none.
The drivers here say Uber has cut their pay from £1.25 per mile to just 75p.
My name's Christina, and I drive with Uber because it gives me the time to spend with my son.
In its adverts, drivers don't get pay cuts. Uber says if drivers didn't think this was an attractive opportunity, the app wouldn't work. These men say they're working around the clock.
I work nearly 6 days, sometimes 7 days. Weekly, I do put in about 70 hours.
70 hours a week?
70 hours a week. If you divide the money you get in by hours, I'm afraid is below the minimum wage.
Uber denies cutting pay recently in London, but rates have been slashed this year in 3 other cities. Uber also hiked the commission it charges drivers. Was 20%, now Uber takes a quarter of a new driver's income. How much difference does that 5% make to you?
It does a lot, because it's a lot, trust me.
So why wouldn't it be a good thing that there's all these dozens of Ubers nearby?
Because there just isn't enough work for all those guys, and the fares are too low.
But James Farrar doesn't just want Uber to pay more. He knows what happens when you're assaulted by a passenger, when the app you think you work for seems reluctant to identify the culprit.
It took them 10 weeks to cooperate with the police, and they demanded that I get a court order in order for them to give that information to the police. And that was the moment when I realized that, listen, you know, this is the dark underbelly of the sharing economy and the private hire trade in London.
Uber says the incident was badly handled and has apologised to James. But he wasn't finished there. James formed a trade organisation for Uber drivers, which he claims has thousands of members. Around 100 of them were surveyed. The vast majority said pay wasn't adequate to meet their family's basic needs. More than half said they'd been physically assaulted, almost 3/4 racially abused. Oh, so this is luxury Uber, is it?
It is indeed.
It's nice. Uber says its drivers don't work for Uber at all. They're self-employed. Many pay hundreds of pounds a month to lease a car. Andy Sozos was one of them, until, in Uber speak, he was deactivated. How's Uber going?
I think they're very, very successful, but for me, unfortunately, no longer active. I've been deactivated, so I don't work with them no more.
Uber says Andy was deactivated due to serious fraudulent activity, after a full investigation and after considering all points of view. You done anything Like that? Anything dodgy?
Dodgy? I'm a driver, I'm a chauffeur, I'm not a detective. Uber send the work out, so I go to every job I get.
We've spoken to a number of deactivated drivers. They say they're cut off without full explanation, without the chance to defend themselves. Did you explain to Uber the situation?
You ever tried to speak to Uber? You got more chance seeing him up there than getting anything out of them.
An employment tribunal will soon decide if Uber drivers should have greater rights. This lawyer is representing couriers in a similar claim.
For these individuals, being characterised as self-employed means they lose some basic employment rights. So they're not, for example, entitled to the living wage, the national minimum wage. They're not entitled to paid time off, paid holiday, for example. And because they're not even treated as employees, if you dismiss them unfairly, they can't bring a claim before an employment tribunal.
Uber says
more than 40,000 licensed drivers across the country use Uber to be their own boss. We don't set shifts or minimum hours. People can switch the app on and off whenever they wish. We're very proud that 2/3 of new drivers using the Uber app were referred by another driver. At the cafe near Heathrow, we ask the drivers who's the boss. They point to their empty cars, then in the distance to a huddle of drivers.
I don't know how they do it, but we can't take any job in this area.
In the car park?
In this car park.
But you can if you're standing about 100 metres away?
Yes.
Is it true that if we're standing here and not over there, you can't get a job on your app?
That's true, man.
If the drivers stand outside the cafe, the app works. If they sit in their cars, Uber blocks it. It's to encourage them to use Heathrow's official driver's car park. But Uber's controlling where you stand in this car park?
Of course. Yeah, that's right.
So the drivers will stand outside through the night, waiting. It's what they do so that we can have Uber everywhere.
Kieran Jenkins reporting. Well, as you would imagine, we did ask Uber to come and talk to us, and unlike many of those in our report, we did manage to speak to them. But they refused, saying that given it featured people involved in ongoing litigation against the company, it wouldn't be appropriate for them to comment any further. We also asked the regulator, Transport for London, to come on. It said it was concerned by the issues you raised, but they are a matter for Uber and the unions representing Uber staff. Well, I'm joined now by Uber driver James Farrar, who you saw in that report, and Ben Southwood from the Adam Smith Institute. Welcome to you both. James, let me start with you. I mean, you talked about the underbelly of the shared economy with your experiences with Uber. But you did join Uber initially because it made you good money.
Well, actually, no, it's never really made good money. What it offers is a flexibility that you can work at a time that's convenient for you.
And you still have that, presumably?
I do have that, yeah, absolutely. But it's, you know, it's not an unreasonable trade-off to say, look, I want flexibility, but I want fair treatment and to be paid fairly as well as 110,000 other individuals around London as well.
And just to be clear, what percentage of the fares that you take does Uber keep?
Well, Uber takes 25% or 20%, depending, off the top at a gross level. And then we keep the rest, but that has to include all your operating costs, insurance, car payments, fuel, and so on.
But you're still doing it because it's still worthwhile for you, right?
Well, less and less, actually. Less and less. And I can't see that I can continue to afford to do the work and support my family, because I've tracked my earnings over the last 12 months, and there's a steady yield decline. I won't be able to afford to do it much longer.
OK, Ben Southwood, what we saw in that report wasn't just an example of kind of freewheeling grassroots capitalism. There was actually an awful lot of regulation there, wasn't there? I mean, the scene with the car parks at the end was quite extraordinary.
Well, that's an interesting, strange kind of side point. I think that probably...
You hadn't seen that before?
I hadn't seen that before, but it's probably quite reasonable to use the standard Heathrow car park. I don't really understand why Uber particularly wants them to do so, but
It's about money, that's why.
But it doesn't seem to make that much difference. I think that James picks up on some very interesting points. I think the overall thing to look at is basically how much people are taking home. So I think the figures for July, on average, Uber drivers made about £16 per hour after Uber's take but before the costs that James raised.
Is that true?
Once you take the costs out, it's about £12 now.
He's actually driving
average,
Uber
I'm
cars.
saying.
Is that number correct?
No, listen, it's absolute nonsense, and I'm sure Ben got this numbers from Uber this afternoon. We've challenged Uber at a protest outside their building to have third-party verification of my earnings, my colleagues' earnings, but also of Uber's data, and they've refused to do that. So these numbers just are not credible, and they're not backed up.
But isn't the other point here that although James likes the flexibility that Uber has to offer, it doesn't mean that you have to do away with all sorts of safeguards for labour. This is stuff that people have been fighting for decades, and it simply doesn't exist with Uber. Uber is weighted very much in favour of the people who own the company, not in favour of the partners, as he's officially called, who work for it.
So that's an interesting way of putting it, but you also have to imagine if every single standard that is in place in every single industry were imposed upon Uber in this particular way, would Uber exist? One of the great things that Uber does is obviates the need for some regulations. For example, in terms of safety, now there have been some very serious issues raised in terms of safety, but one thing that Uber does really well is because everyone knows, Uber knows, the driver knows, the passenger knows, and there's a central record of where every passenger is at any given time. It's much harder for a passenger to get away with doing anything bad to a driver and vice versa. Another interesting improvement they've made technologically is you can get a driver occupied much higher. So they've done large, high-quality academic studies, and they find a very high rate of capacity utilization in Uber and other ride-sharing apps.
OK, so here's the deal. Would you accept more regulation and less flexibility?
Absolutely, and we're crying out for a regulator with a backbone, to be honest with you.
But you joined because of the flexibility.
I joined because of the flexibility, but we all need regulation. Look, in London, this is a city of 8 million people, we need regulation for 3 reasons. There's not enough infrastructure to go around. We need to be kept safe, the drivers, the other road users, and we need, frankly, to prevent labour exploitation. Now, TfL have absolutely reneged on all responsibility for that. We're the largest private hire member organisation in the UK and in London, and we are not even allowed as a stakeholder, to engage with TfL. But meanwhile, the back door is unlocked for all the major corporate operators, and that's why we have such crazy regulation.
But why didn't you just become a minicab driver, work for Addison Lee or one of the other companies?
Well, I am a minicab driver. I work for Uber.
Work for a company with more regulation?
Well, Addison Lee, I'm afraid, is just as bad, because we're in this tremendous race to the bottom that all of these other big operators are aping Uber now, and the consequences for labour is tragic. We need Mayor Sadiq Khan to get a grip of this situation.
Okay. All right. Well, we can't comment on that particular company, but thank you very much to both of you. We've run out of time. James Farrar, Ben Southwood, thanks very much indeed.